Do you have questions about your employment rights? Ask a Lawyer is here for you. Each week, experts from EmploymentLawyer.ca answer your questions. Visit cp24.com/askalawyer and watch Wednesdays at 9:30 p.m. on CP24.
Alrighty, welcome back. Another edition of Ask a Lawyer here on CP24. Your host right here, John Scholes. Joining me momentarily, employment lawyer John Pincus from EmploymentLawyer.ca. He's the guy with all the knowledge, going to answer all the questions. By the way, we encourage you to reach out anytime that this half-hour show is not on air to reach John. How do you do it? Phone number first, 1-888-861-4555. Email is ask@employmentlawyer.ca. There's some other information I'll throw at you during the half hour, and we'll get to that in just a bit. As well as our topic, our main topic in a few minutes is going to be everything you need to know about severance pay. We love severance pay. So we'll drill down on that a little further, maybe get to some phone calls from our long-running radio show, which runs across the country. That's all coming up very shortly, but John Pincus is here, and we always get warmed up with what we call the week that was, or the case of the day, where John enlightens us with something he wants to talk about. It's your choice, pal. What do you say? How are you?
I'm good, and I'm happy to be here. It's very always important to be talking about employment rights and employee rights, because these are things that are always changing. So something that may have been true 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, may not be the same today. And that's why it's so important that we have this opportunity to share this information and to speak with people on a daily basis. Because if you get that information from the wrong source, could be a neighbor, could be a friend, even a friend who's a lawyer, but maybe not an employment lawyer, you get wrong information, and that wrong information can cost you your job. It can cost you tens of thousands of dollars, even hundreds of thousands of dollars. So it's so important to understand this. And I do have a case that I want to talk about that is very much something that is affecting a lot of people, which is the downturn in the technology sector. For the most part, a lot of people that have been coming to us, they've been coming to us with just inadequate severance packages. Pretty straightforward, right? Someone's offered a severance package. It may not be a good severance package, but the issue is, okay, it's not enough. Here's why it should be greater, and here are the things we can do to make it greater. But in this case, someone came to me working for a technology company who was placed on a temporary layoff. And so the company said to him, okay, we're not going to let you go. This is not the termination of your employment. We're going to put you on a temporary layoff, and we're going to recall you sometime within the next 35 weeks. Could be up to 35 weeks. We don't know when. And this is when the person came to me and they said, you know, I think they're doing this for two reasons. A, I don't think they want to pay me a severance package. And B, they're worried that I'm going to try and find a job with a competitor, and they want to keep me out of the competition for as long as possible. And that's something that a lot of employers are having to think about now, especially because non-competition agreements have been made illegal for most employees. The problem in this case is that the company did not have the right to place him on a layoff because he did not agree to be placed on a layoff. And because he did not agree to be placed on a layoff, that is going to be a termination. It's going to be a termination just like any other termination. He's going to be entitled to severance, and severance in this case is going to be significant. It's going to be as much as $75,000, wow. And that's what we're going to be helping this individual to get. And if he had not spoken to us, he would have thought, you know what, there's nothing I can do. I'm going to just have to agree to the layoff. So it's so important for employees to remember, first of all, just because the Ministry of Labor says that layoffs are permissible under the Employment Standards Act, which they are, does not mean that your employer has the ability to do it to you. You have to specifically allow the employer to do this, because that is an extraordinary thing for an employer to do, to say, we're not going to pay you, we're not going to put you to work, but you're still an employee, right? You have to agree to something like that. And the second thing is that if you are asked to sign something midway through employment, at the beginning of employment, that is something you should be speaking to an employment lawyer about, because if this individual had signed something expressly agreeing the company to allow him to lay him off, the outcome could have been very different.
I did mention our radio show, long-running radio show. We've been doing these across the country for well over a decade now. John's part of that, and Lior, and a bunch of other lawyers in the firm. You can tune into those shows weekly, including right here on News Talk 1010, Sundays at 1 p.m. We got great phone calls. You do a good job of talking to us on air, and we cherry-pick some of the good ones. We play them back here, and we talk about them. And we'll get to our first phone call right now.
My wife, she was working for a brokerage for 19 years in a clerical type position, and they told her that her job would be outsourced. For 19 years, they gave her 2 weeks for every year, which was basically 38 weeks. And she also found out that her job that was supposed to be outsourced. They called in a person that was retired to come and do her job. I don't know if she has any legal recourse because I went on your website. She was underpaid about $20-something thousand.
Right. So this caller is kind of right on the money here, right? You know, the key thing you want to look at is whether the severance is adequate. But the other thing that he raises, a lot of people come to us and they say, you know, they told me they were firing me for this reason, but in fact they were actually firing me for this reason. You know, in this case they told me because they were restructuring or they were outsourcing, but they actually brought someone in who was retired. Does the company have the right to do that? In most cases, the answer is yes. They have the right to do that. An employer can terminate your employment for almost any reason, and they can give you a reason that's not necessarily true. Where it becomes a problem is if they have done it for an illegal reason. Well, what's an illegal reason? Well, something that would be discriminatory, something that is ableist, ageist, racist, sexist, right? If you can show there was some discriminatory motive, then the fact that they lied about the reason they were letting you go, then it becomes relevant. Or, for instance, if they let you go right after you made an employment standards complaint, right after you made an occupational health and safety complaint, that is a huge issue because reprisals are forbidden under legislation. But in 95% of the cases, what we're talking about is the inadequacy of the severance package. You know, this person says he believes that it was underpaid by about $20,000. Let's take a look at the Pocket Employment Lawyer and let's see exactly where we fall here. Well, we've got someone who is 56 years old in a clerical position, working there for 19 years. They've been offered 38 weeks, and based on their annual compensation of $40,000, right? 38 weeks, that's about 9 months, just shy of 9 months. So 16 to 18 months, we're talking about up to double what that person has been offered, right? And you can just do the math. We're talking tens of thousands of dollars here. So that is very significant. This is someone who should certainly be speaking to an employment lawyer about getting that severance package improved.
That severance calculator, by the way, can be found at PocketEmploymentLawyer.ca. As I mentioned, the main topic for today, we're going to get into that in a moment. Everything you need to know about severance pay. We'll take a short break and get to that. You want to reach out to John anytime, 1-888-861-4555 and ask at EmploymentLawyer.ca. Lots more Ask a Lawyer is coming right up. Stick around.
You have questions about your employment rights? Ask a Lawyer is here for you. Each week, experts from EmploymentLawyer.ca answer your questions. Visit cp24.com/askalawyer and watch Wednesdays at 9:30 p.m. on CP24.
And welcome back to Ask a Lawyer. This is CP24. John Scholes here and employment lawyer John Pincus from EmploymentLawyer.ca answering all of your questions. Great topic on the show today, as promised. Everything you need to know about severance pay. You think it's easy. Your neighbor, your buddy Steve tells you all about it. Guaranteed they're wrong. That's why we're going to drill down a little bit on the subject right now. First one, John, is this. I mean, look at the terms. Severance pay, termination pay, pay in lieu of notice. There's a million different terms for it. Is there a difference between them all?
You know, on a technical basis, there is a different term. So often when we're talking about severance pay or termination pay, those are terms that are used in the Employment Standards Act, whereas pay in lieu of notice is something that we use for your full entitlements. But for most people, for the vast majority of people, it is effectively the same thing. We're talking about the pay that you receive as a result of of being fired, of losing your employment. And so it's very important not to be confused by looking up things online and saying, okay, I get 1 week per year, I get statutory severance. No, when you're wondering about your termination pay, you can go on the Pocket Employment Lawyer, you can go on the severance pay calculator, and we're talking about all those things. We're talking about your full severance entitlement, which you get as long as your employment has been terminated. You don't get it if you quit, but if you've been fired, you're going to have that entitlement.
The big question everyone always asks is, okay, let's just clear off all the external stuff, and how much pay should I get if I lose my job? That's always the big question, right?
Right. So for most people, we're going to be talking about your full entitlements. We're not going to be talking about 1 week, 2 weeks per year of service. For the vast majority of people, we're going to be looking at your age, your position, we're looking at your length of employment, we're looking at barriers to re-entry, right? Are you in a position that is experiencing a downturn where there's a lot less demand for it? unemployed? Were you disabled at the time of termination? Are you subject to a non-competition clause that may limit your ability to find new employment? And that entitlement can be huge. It can be the difference between your minimum entitlements that you may only know of 8 weeks per year, 8 weeks for your total entitlement, or 2 years, which is typically the maximum someone can be entitled for their full entitlement.
Not everybody has one of these, but when it comes to employment contracts or employment agreements, can that make a difference in your severance, either positive or negative?
It can make a difference, either positive or negative. Often, for most employees, that is negative. An employment agreement can be absolutely devastating, right? We were just talking about there's a huge difference between minimum entitlements and full entitlements. So for someone who works for a small company, that can be the difference between 8 weeks pay and 24 months pay, 2 years pay. So it can be hugely important whether or not you have an employment contract. And for the vast majority of people, there's always exceptions to the rule, but for the vast majority of people, you're better off having an employment contract, right? Unless that employment contract has a very generous termination clause, you're going to be better off without one. And what you have to remember is, did you draft this contract? Because if you didn't draft it, it probably wasn't drafted for your interests. It was drafted for the company's interests. So if you have the opportunity to negotiate that, that's the time to speak with an employment lawyer and have your say.
So if you see 100 severance offers, out of 100, guesstimate how many would have less severance than they're actually owed?
Less severance than they would be owed if they hadn't signed? I'd say about...
Or a proper amount anyway, right?
I would say about 95 out of 100.
Yeah.
95 out of 100.
Yeah. Very common, right?
It's very, very common because, when people come to me, for instance, employers come to me too, often what they ask is, how can I pay the least amount of severance possible? And there's a legal way to have employees agree to just the minimum. But as an employee, you have to know that there's an alternative.
Can your employer refuse to pay you more severance? They might try, but can they?
Well, they can refuse to pay your proper severance. They can refuse to pay you severance at all.
Right.
In fact, in many of the cases we're dealing with companies that have alleged that the employee has quit, or they've alleged just cause, and they can say it. There's nothing stopping the employer from saying it, right? And as an employment lawyer, I can't get you your job back, but the law will obligate them to pay you your proper severance. And if they've done something illegal, they're going to pay through it substantially. Again,
EmploymentLawyer.ca, that's the channel you'll want to go through. The website, you'll have a media page, Knowledge Center under Media. You'll find a radio station somewhere near you, especially if you're living in Ontario, that will carry our weekly radio show, including News Talk 1010, Sundays at 1 p.m. You'll catch us taking phone calls. We get a lot of phone calls on the show. We're going to play back number 2 right now and talk about it, John.
So I was working at a dealership for 4 years. I was poached by another dealership, and they told me that they wanted to give me a position in management. I went there. They switched it on me, and they said, oh, well, actually, we're going to make you this position. And then next thing you know, the position just turned out to be totally different from what I left another job for. It didn't end up working out, and I had to quit because they paid me half of what I was making before.
Something about the automotive industry, John, it's just a hotbed for employment conflict. I don't know how else to describe it.
It's Wild West.
There's just a lot of disputes that arise in that sector. Yeah. Well, this is a really interesting situation because it's what I call the wrongful hire, right? So someone makes a misrepresentation in the context of hiring you, and you get there and it turns out it's not the same as what you thought it was going to be. And in that case, you can actually go after that employer for what you have lost as a result of them misrepresenting that to you. The other situation that we're often talking about when you are recruited from a previous employer, especially if you've been there for a long time and you expect, well, I'll at least be at this company for a few years, 5 years, 10 years, and all of a sudden a year goes by and they let you go without cause, then that becomes something we can consider in the assessment of your severance entitlements. So that's when we're looking not just at your age, position, and length of service, but we're looking at the length of service that you had at the previous employer and considering that in how much you're owed from the employer that just let you go.
Loving these phone calls. I want to get to one more, though, but we got to slide in a quick break first, so we'll do that now. In the meantime, reaching out to John and the team. Simple, 1-888-861-4555. If you prefer email, that is ask@employmentlawyer.ca. We'll continue. This is Ask a Lawyer here on CP24.
You have questions about your employment rights? Ask a Lawyer is here for you. Each week, experts from EmploymentLawyer.ca answer your questions. Visit cp24.com/askalawyer and watch Wednesdays at 9:30 p.m. on CP24.
All right, thank you so much for hanging in here on Ask a Lawyer on CP24. I mentioned our third phone call from our long-running radio shows. Let's to it right now and talk about it. Here you go.
I'm a healthcare professional at one of the hospitals. I'm 48. I've worked there for almost 25 years, regular part-time. And there's been some cutbacks this year, and there's been some talk about reducing my hours. Can they actually cut back my hours? I don't have to accept that, right?
Well, in many cases, you don't have to. This is something that definitely warrants speaking to an employment lawyer because this is a tricky situation, right? If you leave and you say, oh, I don't have to accept this and it's a constructive dismissal, and it turns out it's not a constructive dismissal, it's a resignation. So step one is speak to an employment lawyer. But generally speaking, you've been working somewhere for 25 years. You've had the same hours for the entirety of that 25 years tenure, and they're going to change it, and they're going to change it substantially without your permission. No, that's a breach of contract, that's a constructive dismissal, and you should act quickly, because if you don't act quickly and continue to work under those part-time hours, those reduced hours for a substantial period of time, well, then it may be too late to do anything about it. So time is not on your side here, but if she expressly objects to it, then she has the option of treating that as a constructive dismissal, and that means she's going to be entitled to severance just like anyone else who's let go. How much severance is that going to be? Well, let's take a look at the Pocket Employment Lawyer and let's see how much we're really talking about. So she's 48 years old. She's been there for 25 years, and we don't know in this case how much income she's earning, but we know that it could be up to 24 months pay, right? So we consider, if she's earning, let's say, $75,000 a year, that's an $150,000 entitlement that's at stake here, right? So this is not something you want to guess with, this is not something you want to play around with, and this is not something you want to wait on. You have to understand your options and understand them right now, and this is the time to speak to an employment lawyer.
Another way to follow Mr. Pincus anytime, does a lot of live streaming on YouTube and Facebook and LinkedIn. How do you join? At stlawyers.ca, at stlawyers.ca. Here's a question for tonight's show. John says, I was let go without severance after 10 years with the company. My employment contract includes a 2-year non-compete clause. Is it valid? Will it hold up if I get a job with a direct competitor? What do you think?
Well, here's an answer that might surprise you, John, and might surprise a lot of our viewers. For all intents and purposes, as a practical matter, is it valid? It doesn't really matter. It doesn't really matter. And it doesn't matter because even if it is invalid, what is that employer going to do if you breach it? They're going to sue you. They're going to sue your current employer. They're going to bring in an injunction. You're going to have to retain a lawyer. You're going to pay thousands in legal fees. You have to assume, if you've already signed it, that it is legal. Now, it is true that non-compete clauses are typically unenforceable. And it's also true that the provincial government has taken the pretty significant step of making non-competition agreements invalid for everyone except executives, and that came into force at the end of 2021. So agreements that was starting on October 25th, 2021, and it was made effective in December. So if an agreement was concluded after 2021, in 2022 with a non-compete clause, that's pretty obviously going to be not enforceable. But you still want to act on it. You still want to get an express waiver, an express acknowledgement that it's not going to apply. And by the way, when we're talking about severance entitlements, if your employer has a non-compete agreement and it has any impact on your ability to find employment, because you're going to have to disclose this to potential employers, then that is something that is going to increase the severance entitlement.
We will grab another email after a short break, which we'll do right now, so stick around for it. It may be yours. How do you reach out to John? Again, that phone number, 1-888-861-4555. And the email address is ask@employmentlawyer.ca. We're coming right back with more Ask a Lawyer. Hang on.
You have questions about your employment rights? Ask a Lawyer is here for you. Each week, experts from EmploymentLawyer.ca answer your questions. Visit cp24.com/askalawyer and watch Wednesdays at 9:30 p.m. on CP24.
Alrighty, welcome back to Ask a Lawyer here on CP24. A few minutes to go. John Scholes along with John Pincus. He does all the heavy lifting. He's the employment lawyer. You want to reach out to John, you can. 1-888-861-4555. Ask@employmentlawyer.ca, which is where we're going for another email right now. This one's a beauty, John. This employer is definitely in the rankings for Employer Boss of the Year. Email says, my boss is demanding that I return from disability leave. He says I'm not considering the company's needs. He's threatening to cut my pay by at least 15% if I don't return within the next 2 weeks. What should I do? Brutal.
Well, that is absolutely inappropriate, and it should be common to really anyone, even if you're not an employment lawyer, that this is clearly not an appropriate way to treat someone who's on a disability. Now, your rights when you're on a disability, when you're on a sick leave, are not unlimited, right? You do have a duty to cooperate. You do have a duty to make sure that you're communicating with your employer as to what the nature of your prognosis is, what accommodations you're going to need when you're going to come back. You might have to fill out a functional abilities form, a cognitive abilities evaluation form. But once you have done that, your employer has to accommodate you up to what we call undue hardship. Now, what does undue hardship mean? It means it has to be next to, it doesn't have to be actually impossible, but it has to be almost next to impossible. It has to significantly impact the business in order to be able to accommodate you. Now, if that happens, that doesn't mean they can cut your pay. What it means is that they can let you go and pay you only your minimum entitlements under what's called frustration, okay? But it doesn't mean they can do any of these things that this employer is describing. In this case, the employer has made no impact, it looks like, to accommodate this person. So that person's going to be entitled to severance, and it is going to be a human rights violation, right? Frustration of contract, very difficult to establish, and it really doesn't seem like that's going on here.
That duty to accommodate, that threshold increases with the size of the employer. A mom and pop shop wouldn't have to do as much as, say, a multinational corporation with thousands of employees, yeah?
That's exactly right, John. It's going to increase the threshold of what we call undue hardship, right? So if someone at a company, at a very large company, says, I can come back, but I need you to purchase a new chair for me, and this chair is going to cost $1,000. It's going to be very difficult for a company with, even a company with 100 employees to say, we can't do that, right? Or if someone says, I need reduced hours, I need someone to fill in for me at this time, that's when it's going to make a big difference, right? Because if you have a lot of employees, you're going to have someone who can fill in the gaps. Might not be convenient, might be a little bit more costly, but that's the cost of doing business.
And the cost of doing business, part of that is watching this show. Thank you so much for tuning in for this half hour. I'm going to leave you some contact information as we wrap up for another night. To reach John and his team, the phone number's first, 1-888-861-4555. That email address is ask@EmploymentLawyer.ca. And don't forget the website. It's free, it's anonymous. You'll have access to the severance calculator, pocket.employmentlawyer.ca. Thanks so much for joining us. Reach out anytime you would like. We're back here. Of course, you can reach us on radio as well. News Talk 1010, Sundays at 1 p.m. And we'll join you. You join us for another edition of Ask a Lawyer here on CP24. Thanks for watching.